Good evening. Over the course of a few weeks, we have been talking about the apostles of those lessons. I think we're doing 8 total, and so we're halfway through. And so far, we've looked at, I would argue, probably the 4 best known of the apostles. Maybe not the, if we want to use infamous, then Judas probably goes in that group as well. But we've talked about Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And so far, there are 2 groups that are almost always mentioned together. Peter and Andrew are mentioned together. James and John are mentioned quite often together. And that's because both of them were sets of brothers. They were siblings. So Peter and Andrew are brothers. James and John were brothers as well. In both cases, and we talked about this, typically one gets mentioned a little more than the other. Peter was talked about much more than Andrew. John, we see much more than James. Tonight, we're going to maybe see something similar. 2 people that are often talked about together, one who we know a little bit about, and one who we know almost nothing about. About tonight, the 2 names that you see on the screen there, Philip, 2 of the 12 apostles, and how that in the reality of the situation is we don't know a ton about either one. And one we know even less about 1 or 2 other apostles. Let's talk about Philip first. And I want to use the word tonight, Philip the apostle, because there's a difference. Philip the apostle. Philip the apostle is mentioned only 8 times in the New Testament. 4 of those 8 times are when the apostles are listed. So it's almost like the teacher call and roll at school. It just notifies that he's there. So there's not a whole lot of stories in this in each of our studies. It was a relatively common name. There are 3 other people named Philip in the New Testament. 2 were sons of King Herod, and 1 is a name that we don't always use, but probably should to clarify, and that is Philip the evangelist. It's 2 different people that are there. It's often mistaken, and I dare say that Philip the evangelist is far more well known than Philip the apostle. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go as well. But Philip is a reasonably well-known apostle. The other tonight is Bartholomew. And he is one of the most obscure apostles. In fact, we don't totally know what is that this evening as well. It only appears in the 4 list of Jesus's 12 main apostles. We see nothing about him with any title or description. That's Bartholomew. All we really know is his name and that he's closely associated with Philip. The fact that they're sort of linked together could mean, much like Peter and Andrew, much like James and John, my cousins, might be neighbors, might be friends, who knew? We don't really know. But they're sort of associated there together. So what I want to do tonight is I want to look at who these people are. We'll talk about how they died, at least the traditional description of how they died. And we'll look at some examples in the Bible as well. Let's start with who was Philip. And as we mentioned earlier, sometimes the 2 Philips get confused. Philip the apostle and Philip the evangelist. I'm going to go to Acts chapter 6. I want you to go there with me this evening, and let's talk or read for just a second a description of some people. This is Acts chapter 6. And we're going to look at verse 2 to 6, but I tell you what, let's actually just start with verse 1 to sort of set the stage. At the top of chapter 6, it says, 7 chosen to serve. Disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Let's talk about that for just a second, because that's not really relevant to who they are, but it is a situation that was happening there. So the church is growing in Acts chapter 6. And we see that there's two groups of people. It's very common. You have the Hebrews, that's the Jewish people who have become Christians, followers of Jesus. You have the Hellenists, which probably would be used as Greeks, but maybe more so as just a generic term for Gentiles. But either way, you have these two groups that sort of come from different cultural backgrounds. And there's an argument that arises because it says that the Hebrews were neglecting the distribution to the Hellenists. This is the best way to describe it is you have two groups of people, and they're saying, well, I need to help this group more than I need to help that group. Disciples and said, it is not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. I think it's important to look at something here. In verse 2, it says the 12. Who are the 12? Those are the apostles. And we've established that Philip is one of the apostles, Philip the apostle. But they say it doesn't, in our words, what they're saying is we have too much work to do preaching and teaching to deal with these distributions of food and clothing and all that within the community. That's completely understood. I suspect that the elders of this church have enough to do that they would greatly appreciate you serving in roles to help out. Let's go further. Verse 3, therefore, a box there that says guaranteed 12 years in storage. It ought to say guaranteed in usage. Verse 5, verse 4. It's verse 3. Let's go back. I don't know. I've lost where we are. But it said, therefore, seek out from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. And they're saying we need people that are going to do this job. Verse 4. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. So there's a clear divide between what the apostles are going to do and what these other people are going to do. Verse 5. And the saying pleased the whole multitude, and they chose, listen to the names carefully, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith in the Holy Spirit, and Philip. This is not Philip the apostle. It doesn't make sense for it to be, because Philip the apostle is one of the 12 that's mentioned in the first sentence. Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch, whom they set before the apostles. And when they had prayed, they laid hands on them. And so what we see here is this choose. Those are names that you'll never see again. But Stephen comes up again as well. And so sometimes there could be job sort of looks like the job of a deacon. I don't know if it really is technically the job, because outlines for deacons and elders aren't even existing at this point. But the work is clearly sets a precedent for there needs people that are doing work within the congregation. Let's go a little bit further. Philip the evangelist, not the apostle, is referenced again in Acts chapter 21 and verse 8 when he is called, quote, one of the 7, not an apostle or one of the 12. It was the evangelist that is probably the most famous Philip story in the Bible, which is Acts chapter 8, whenever he is speaking to the Ethiopian youth. Now, what does that all mean? Well, Daniel, have you worked really hard to confuse us as to who the Philips might be right there? Well, I hope not. But I do want you to see that even though you are an apostle, and even though your name is shared with somebody else, that somebody else might be more famous than you are. It is him in John chapter 1 and verse 43 who Jesus asked when he said, follow me. Maybe not ask, maybe telling is a better way to say it. That request was accepted, and it subsequently brought us to our next person. Confused. If there's confusion about who Philip was, because there's too many Philips, the exact opposite is true because there aren't enough Bartholomews. You might have says up there, who was Bartholomew / Nathaniel? Let's go into it for just a second. To start with, Bartholomew's name, and this is from everything that I can tell, almost assuredly comes from the Aramaic name Bar-Ptolemy or Ptolemy. That means son of Ptolemy. You might say, well, that doesn't make sense to me. Well, bear with me for just a second. We see Bar in front of names in the Bible in other places. Jesus referenced Peter as Simon, do you remember? Simon Bar-Jonah in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 17. That meant that Peter, Simon Peter's father, was named Jonah. And so much like Peter, it would sort of stand to reason that Bartholomew might have been known by another name. They weren't calling him Bar-Jonah. In fact, there's a whole other story that this guy's name is very well something son of Ptolemy, Bartholomew. Now, Bartholomew is a name that exists today that we use infrequently, but it's still an existing name. So if that's his name, then maybe what's his actual go-by name? Well, most people have argued that his actual name was Nathaniel. Nathaniel appears to be an apostle in the Gospel of John. Nathaniel is closely associated with Philip, and there is no Bartholomew that is mentioned in the Gospel of John. So it seems odd that you would be listed in one place, not listed in another, except perhaps you go by one name and there's a different one. Some of you may have that experience in your life as well. Some of you maybe go by one name at home and another name at work. I go by Daniel. But when my kids get their schoolwork or their school information, it says Jonathan. Now, I've fussed at my parents for years about that being very confusing. But that's just how it works. A lot of us do the same way. So let's go a little bit further with who this Bartholomew / Nathaniel might be. Well, I don't know if we can say 100%, but we can pretty much figure out that it's arguable that these are the same people, that Nathaniel Bartholomew is the same person. If Bartholomew is Nathaniel, then John gives us a couple verses that look into his character. Turn to John chapter 1 in verse 46. John chapter 1 and verse 46, we talked about this with the apostles before, and I want to mention it again, but it's not a new story for you. In John chapter 1 and verse 46, Philip has just told Nathaniel about Jesus. And Nathaniel is a bit skeptical about this whole thing because Nathaniel says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, it's a fair point if you are looking at things from his point. They have this sort of negative view of Nazareth. Philip comes, if you go and look, Philip has just been asked by Jesus or told by Jesus to follow him. And so Philip finds Nathaniel. He gives him this big story. And he says, oh, very skeptical. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, let's go a little bit further with what happens there because we don't leave the story right there. A couple of verses later, we see, you can go with me here. 47. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, this is Jesus, should be in red, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. That's an interesting way to phrase things, but it's also him sort of saying, I know who you are, maybe. Verse 48. Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? Don't really seem to know him. Nathanael has a negative impression of who Jesus was. Jesus answered and said to him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Verse 49. That clearly has moved Nathanael. Nathanael went from a skeptical, I don't know that any kind of Messiah is going to come out of Nazareth, to verse 49 saying, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. So it changed him really quickly from, I don't know, to perhaps I do know. Before we get any further, I've plugged these in, and I kind of like to mention it. How did they die? None of this is scriptural, so you just got to bear with me for just a second. But we have to consider history and tradition. Let's talk about Philip first. These are suggestions of how Philip died. One tradition says that he died of natural causes, but others suggest that he was stoned to death, that he was beheaded. One said that he was crucified of old age. That sounds like the talk of people who don't really know what happened to him. I do know, I say crucified of old age, crucified upside down. That crucified upside down comes up a lot. I feel like it's probably not a true thing at all, but it became a story that sort of went for a lot of people. I don't think they would have said it about all of them, but nonetheless, we don't really know what it would have been. Okay? Bartholomew has even more possible causes of death. I want you to look at these real quick. Again, this is not scriptural, it's all just traditional. But if we look at them, number one, he was flayed alive and then beheaded. If you want a real description of what that's like, if you don't want it, close your ears real quick. If you want a real description of what that's like, they peeled his skin off and then beheaded. Second one, beaten and then crucified. Third one, maybe he was crucified upside down. That's why I say I don't know. It feels like that's coming up a lot, so I don't know if I believe it. Only beheaded. What I was reading is some say he was only beheaded. You know, the easy stuff, right? You know, just the simple things. And then beaten unconscious and thrown into the sea to drown. I don't know if it's any of those. I don't know anything about any of them. They're all tradition. I found nothing that said Bartholomew/Nathaniel died of old age, though. But nonetheless, this shows that all of these apostles, with the exception of what we read about a few days ago, all of these apostles met sort of untimely deaths for the work that they were doing with the church. We've talked a little bit about that on Wednesday night, and we got to the point on Wednesday to where some of the early treatment of the Christians had started to change. It had started to improve once Rome accepted Christianity. But this is way before Rome had accepted anything, and these people were being killed as a result of their beliefs. Again, I can't tell you that these are true or not. These are simply tradition. What we can look at as true is what I want to look at right here to finish up. Where do we see them in the Bible? Well, one of the few details that we have in the Bible about Philip is in John chapter 1 and verse 44. And it says, now Philip was from Bethsaida. And then it also says this was the city of Andrew and Philip. Andrew and Peter, I'm sorry. Too many names. Andrew and Peter. So it says that he was from Bethsaida. Later, when some Greek men from Bethsaida go to see Jesus, they come to Philip first, and presumably this might have been because he was from a nearby town or had some connection too. But we mentioned earlier that Philip introduced Nathaniel to Jesus. And he introduced him with a simple, come and see, right? Come and see. The only of Philip that we see occur in John. Turn to John chapter 6. We're going to look at a couple verses real quick. This is at the feeding of the 5,000. We looked at this story the other day. The unfortunate part of some of these apostle stories is they overlap, so I have to tell them more than once. But in John chapter 6, starting in verse 5, then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where is thy bread that these may eat? Verse 6, but this he said to test Philip, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus. Verse 7, Philip answered and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them might have a little. We talked about that the other day, but Philip approached this in the way that a lot of us would have approached it as well. It's probably not realistic to be able to feed all of these people. He looked at it from a monetary sense. If we had 200 denarii, we wouldn't be able to buy enough bread to feed all of these people. But it said in the reading that Jesus was testing him, right? He knew that Philip was going to come about this with sort of the mathematical answer, with the practical or the impractical answer. But they end up feeding the 5,000 and had a whole lot left over in the process. Later on in John chapter 14, verse 6 through 10, it's what Kevin read a few moments ago, Philip asked Jesus to show them God the Father. Jesus responded by saying, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. That's John chapter 14. That's pretty late in the story right there. But even at that point, even the apostles, even the chosen people were struggling to sort of wrap their mind around who Jesus was. Think about that for a second. In John chapter 6, Jesus has fed 5,000 people in plain eyesight of Philip. 8 chapters later, Philip is still wanting to know, what's the connection here? What is this that we're seeing right here? Toward the end of the Gospel of John, Bartholomew / Nathaniel comes up again. John chapter 21, that's where we're going to turn, and I would encourage you to go there as well. John chapter 21, and we're going to look at verses 1, 2, and 3. You can read the whole chapter this evening if you'd like to, and it's a good one to finish the Gospels on. But John chapter 21, verses 1, 2, and 3. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee. And in this way, he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, and 2 others of his disciples were together. And we said one of them probably was Andrew, but he didn't get mentioned right there. Number 3, verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. And they said to him, we are going with you also. And they went out, immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Now you can read more about the story because Jesus shows up right there. But I point that out to show you that's the last place that we see Bartholomew / Nathaniel. We do know, though, that several of the apostles were fishermen. Peter, James, and John, plus Andrew most likely, even though he's unnamed there. So we can either deduce that Nathaniel / Bartholomew was a fisherman, or maybe he was just taking to learn and read, right? That actually might make a lot of sense because I would imagine once Jesus is gone, the apostles were faced with the kind of question of what do we do now, right? There might have been some concern about that. So who knows? I don't know if Nathaniel was a fisherman or not. It sure seems like he probably was. But we don't see any more of either one of them. Show's over for them right there. We don't know how they died, other than just some sort of wild guesses. And if you looked at that previous slide, that's sort of guessing at everything as to how they died. We don't see them write any books that would later appear in the Bible. We don't see them mentioned by Paul in his writings or Peter or in the Revelation. We don't see them anywhere. Now, the Bible is full of bold people, right? Think of bold people in the Bible. People like Moses, right? People like Elijah, Old Testament characters. People like Peter and Paul in the New Testament. People that just sort of come on the scene and they were always there on the scene. But there's also a whole lot of quieter, careful, analytical, reflective people in the Bible as well. Jesus invited Philip. Philip invited Bartholomew. It didn't come easy to Bartholomew. We read that just a second ago, that Bartholomew and Nathaniel here, when he read that, when he was told about this, he didn't really believe. Didn't think it was practical or possible that the Messiah would come from there. But after a little bit of talk and a little bit of thinking, he made a pretty wise decision in following Jesus. What's the first thing you always think of when you think of Peter? Head first into the pool, right? If the whole church was head first into the pool, church wouldn't last very long. The church has to have people of reason, people that are analytical, people that consider things. It's not a doubt or a question. It's not a lack of faith to think things over a second time before we act. I think sometimes we struggle with this in the church, that if we don't jump headfirst in, then maybe we're not fully committed to it. But the church needs people to sit back and think for a second, is this the right way? Because how many times did Peter jump out of the boat, literally and figuratively, and then realize, oops, might have made a mistake here, right? There's a place for both in the church. There's a need for both in the church, but not to the detriment of the other. Not all Christians have the same personalities. The church thrives on bold and steady, but it also thrives on calm and thoughtful as well. These are the church. The church was started by these apostles. And for every Peter, Andrew, James, and John, there's Phillips and Bartholomew's whose name didn't get mentioned, but who the church could not have become what it was without. And just like them then, the church today has Peter's, Andrew's, James's, and John's, but there's a whole lot of space in the pews for Phillips and Bartholomew's as well. The name doesn't have to be written real broad to be a significant and important member of the church. And if you want that to be you, I do too. You might be thinking that you've been wanting to become part of the church. Or maybe you've drifted from the church and you wanted to come back to it. Maybe you're looking at this and saying, what can I do to maybe be a little bit more head first into the water? Or you might be thinking, maybe I've been quick to jump and I need a little bit of help in becoming more patient and more thoughtful. Whatever it is, that's what the church stands here for, ready to help you, whatever it may be. Whatever it is, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.